Hello, hello. We will now talk about neurotransmitters and neurotransmission. We've talked about the electrical part of electrochemical transmission. We talked about the action potential, which is the change in voltage. Now we're going to talk about the chemical part, about the neurotransmitters, what they are, how they bind to receptors, and how they do their thing. All right. So neurotransmission is electrochemical. And the electrical part, as I said, is the action potential, but the chemical part, the single neuron can receive input from many thousands of synaptic connections, and they're all releasing a neurotransmitter. And I just have a little image of all this in deep web of all the thousands of neurotransmitters affecting thousands of others. It's very, very complex. But what is a neurotransmitter? It's a chemical. And it's a chemical that's released from the presynaptic nerve terminal, from the axon terminal. And what it does is it crosses the synapse and it binds to receptors. And there's specific receptors that are on the postsynaptic cell. And then that's going to cause an electrical change in the postsynaptic cell. So a neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, may bind to a receptor, and that might open up an ion channel and let sodium in. That would be a tiny little depolarization, a tiny little positive ion coming in, which will depolarize it. Or another neurotransmitter like GABA might come in and let a little bit of chloride into the cell. That would be a hyperpolarization. So these neurotransmitters bind, and they're going to stimulate chemically gated channels, let a chemical in, and that's going to cause a change in the ions that are entering. It's going to cause a change in the electrical potential. So let's just go over some of the neurotransmitters. There's over 100 neurotransmitters. First one was only discovered about 100 years ago, but we now have discovered hundreds of them. But I'm going to do, I don't know, the big 8. I'm just going to talk about a few of them, because these are ones you really should know, big picture, what they do in the body. So norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is another name for noradrenaline. So epinephrine and adrenaline are the same thing. We'll talk about this more when we get to endocrinology and the hormones, but maybe you've heard of a nephron as part of the kidney. So epinephrine sits on top of the kidney, and adrenal is kidney, adrenaline, it's from a gland that sits on top of the kidney. But in America, adrenaline is a trade name. And so if you go to England, they call it adrenaline, but here we call it norepinephrine and epinephrine. Anyway, norepinephrine is very similar to epinephrine, which is adrenaline. And you know what adrenaline does to your body. It's fight or flight. So it's going to increase your sympathetic nervous system, the run away from something that's frightening you. It's involved in it's in the reticular activating system of the brain that helps keep you alert and paying attention. The limbic system, which is emotions, and your cerebral cortex. And as I said, it's also in the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. So what norepinephrine is involved with arousal and awake and emotions, usually happier emotions, but also can be fear and anger, mood and sex and appetite. And it increases your heart rate and it dilates the bronchi that go to your lungs. Because think about what sympathetic nervous system does. It's like, wakes you up, run away, heart's beating, getting ready to fight or flight. Dopamine. That is found in the hypothalamus, the basal ganglia, which is for fine-tuning muscle movements, and the nucleus accumbens. You might not have heard of the nucleus accumbens. It is for reward, addiction, motivation. And a lot of these brain areas we'll talk about in coming videos. So you may not have heard of them at this point, but for this test, it's all together. We will talk about the basal ganglia and the nucleus accumbens in coming up videos. So what dopamine does? It's also emotions and mood, appetite, sex, motor functions. Dopamine is low with Parkinson's disease. All right, it's involved with reward, motivation, and addiction. Pretty much any drug that you can get addicted to, either directly or indirectly, will affect dopamine. Very involved with not just addiction, but reward and motivation. You really want to get that drug. You might not love it anymore, but you're really craving it. You're motivated to get it. So with that in mind, some drugs that affect norepinephrine and dopamine, and Norepinephrine and dopamine are structurally very similar. Dopamine becomes norepinephrine. So amphetamine and cocaine, these both increase levels of norepinephrine and dopamine in the synapse. And they do it in different ways, which in neuroscience we'll talk about. Some antidepressants will affect these. They can affect dopamine, increase dopamine and norepinephrine. Antipsychotics, drugs that treat schizophrenia, lower dopamine. There's one theory on schizophrenia is that in certain parts of the brain, dopamine is too high. So you want to treat it by lowering it. And Parkinson's disease is low dopamine, so you want to increase it. So all of these are drugs that affect norepinephrine and dopamine. Serotonin comes from sero, blood, and tone. It's all over the place. You don't have to learn specifically where this is. You find it all over the brain and body. And what it does, many, many things. One way to look at it is it modulates raw information and gives it emotional tone. Well, what does that mean? If you look at a glass, another neurotransmitter, glutamate, lets you see a glass of water. Serotonin, how do you feel about it? Is that glass half empty or half full? So it gives it that emotional tone. You ate food. So glutamate tells you, oh, I ate food, I feel it in my tummy. But serotonin, do you feel guilty about that sandwich? Do you feel turned on? I don't know, by chocolate? Sure. How do you feel about that information is serotonin. And it's also involved with sleep, appetite. There are a number of diet drugs that go on serotonin. None of them work. Never use one, please. It's involved with aggression and migraine. Some of you with migraines, I'm very sorry for that, but a lot of drugs affect serotonin for that. Sex drive, regulation of moods. Most antidepressants we give out now increase levels of serotonin. We think that depression is due to low serotonin. There's really no evidence that it does at all. And I got my PhD studying depression. And so we were really kind of throwing antidepressants at people even though they don't usually work. That's a whole nother class. Let's see, serotonin also is involved with nausea and hallucinations. LSD involves serotonin receptors. So some drugs that affect serotonin, Prozac and Zoloft, these are antidepressants. Fen-phen, Redux and Meridia, pretty much all of these are now taken off the market. They are diet drugs, which do not work and can kill you. Don't take them. Ecstasy. For you young folk, today you call it Molly. It's the same thing. Ecstasy and Molly are all MDMA, methylene dioxymethamphetamine. Those affect serotonin, and LSD and psilocybin, magic mushrooms, do as well. So serotonin does a whole bunch of things. GABA. This one's easier. Major inhibitory neurotransmitter in your brain. This is what it's involved with sleep. It slows you down. It takes away anxiety. This one shuts things down more. And a lot of what your brain does is shut things down. We couldn't function if we had access to all the information that we're always exposed to. And so it's overall inhibition. So some drugs that GABA, that affect GABA is, if you've heard of benzodiazepines, Xanax, and Valium, Halcyon, Roofies is Rohypnol. So you may have Klonopin. Those are all benzos. Barbiturates are not used as much anymore because they're pretty dangerous, but they are downers. Phenobarbital, secobarbital, pentobarbital, these put you to sleep, decrease anxiety. They can use as a short-term anesthetic. And alcohol. Alcohol affects many neurotransmitters, but one of the major ones is GABA. It's inhibitory. Glutamate is your main excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain. And if there's too much of it, that can be neurotoxic. That can kill swaths of neural tissue. Too much can cause seizure. But this is the main neurotransmitter for your senses. Pretty much every sense, pain uses substance P as well, but every sense uses glutamate. So to see, to hear, to smell, to taste, glutamate's all over the place. Glutamate's also involved with learning and memory and taste, as I said. Some drugs that affect glutamate, if you've heard of PCP, it used to be called angel dust. Ketamine. Ketamine is a very interesting drug. It used to be a rave drug, but it's now approved for getting somebody off of a bad depression. It works rather fast. And ethanol, alcohol, also affects glutamate. Acetylcholine. was the first neurotransmitter that was identified back around 1920. And you find it in the motor cortex, your autonomic nervous system, that is your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, and the neuromuscular junction. We talked about that. That's where your motor neurons affect your muscle. My cat won't stop playing with my pen. Okay, move, kitty. All right. And what does acetylcholine do? It's involved with a number of things. Sleep. Many neurotransmitters are involved with sleep, different stages of sleep. Memory. Alzheimer's disease, you start to lose acetylcholine receptors, they're destroyed, and motor function at the neuromuscular junction. So some drugs that affect acetylcholine. Nicotine. Nicotine directly binds to what we call nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. And there's some other drugs that bind to different kind of receptors. I will not ask you about nicotinic and muscarinic receptors, so don't worry about that. But atropine, maybe you've heard of that, also affects acetylcholine. And your endogenous opioids. That our bodies make our own form of morphine. Basically, that's where endorphin comes from the word endogenous, which means in your body, and morphine. So we discovered, it's a really actually cool story. They found opioid receptors in our brains in the 1970s. So if we have a receptor for something in our brain, it means our bodies make a natural form of it. We don't have a receptor on the off chance that we'll find a poppy and stab it and get the sap out of it and smoke the sap as heroin. We don't have receptors for that. If we have a receptor for something, it means our bodies make a natural form of it. So when they found the receptors that morphine bound to, they said, woo, we have a natural form. And they found endorphins, enkephalins, and others. And what they do, they're all over the brain and spinal cord, especially the hypothalamus, the limbic system. This is emotions and memory, among other things, pituitary gland. Pain, they help alleviate pain, or you may still feel pain, but you don't care anymore. They are involved with increasing sleep and emotions. They also inhibit the coughing reflex and eventually breathing reflex if you take too much. They can cause constipation. They kind of slow up the GI tract and can stop the effect of vomiting reflex. And some drugs that affect opioids, morphine, opium, heroin, OxyContin, Percocet, all of those. Alrighty, last one. Endogenous cannabis and endocannabinoid system. This is fascinating, and I teach a number of courses on it. We also have cannabinoid receptors. And the fact that we have cannabinoid receptors means that we don't have the receptor just on the off chance that we would find this plant and smoke it. It meant we have our endogenous, our bodies make a form of cannabis. And it's everywhere. There are more receptors for this than any other what we call metabotropic receptors. It's in every single system in the body. It's all over the brain. It's all over the body, pretty much every organ system. It's in the cortex, hippocampus, cerebellum, uterus. It's not, though, in your brainstem. This is one of the reasons there's never been, as far as humanity knows, an overdose fatality of cannabis. You easily overdose on opioids and alcohol. You can overdose on tobacco. Smoke 20 cigarettes at once, you got a 50-50 chance of dropping dead on the spot. No known overdoses of cannabis, maybe because there's no receptors in the brainstem, in most of the brainstem. And the cannabinoid receptors, these are called CB1 and CB2, there's probably others as well, but we're just learning. Now, what we call phytocannabinoids, at marijuana, or cannabis, we should call it, has many chemicals. You've heard of THC, you've certainly heard of CBD. There's 140 different cannabinoids in the plant, and they bind not only to the cannabinoid receptors, but they bind to serotonin and GABA and glutamate and dopamine. They bind to all of them. And so what the endocannabinoid system does, they say it's involved with eat, sleep, relax, forget, protect. It is widespread. It may be one of the most important neurotransmitter systems involved with homeostasis, keeping steady state. If you have an injury or stress or something, endocannabinoids are made on demand to help fix that situation. If you take neuroscience, we'll talk about it more in depth if I teach an entire course on cannabis. And next year, there will be a physiology and pharmacology of cannabis class, in which I'll also talk about magic mushrooms and some other psychedelic plants. So that's a coming attraction. I think I'm going to close this one out now, and we will talk about neurotransmission in the next video.